The morning began with a flicker of digital dissonance that Elias Thorne should have recognized as the first symptom of a collapsing reality. As a high-frequency trader in the heart of London, his life was built on the rigid, unwavering architecture of mathematics. He existed in the spaces between decimal points, a man who saw the world as a beautiful, solvable equation. But at 8:02 a.m., as he stared at his smartwatch to time his morning espresso, the digital display didn't show numbers. It showed a chaotic vibration of strokes that looked like a dying spider's legs. He blinked, thinking it was a glitch, a smear on the glass, or perhaps the onset of a stroke. He looked up at the coffee machine's price display, and his blood turned to ice. The price for a latte was no longer £4.50, it was a shifting, indecipherable symbol that pulsed with a nauseating rhythm. Elias shook his head, looking at the barista, expecting to see confusion. But the girl behind the counter was staring at the register with a vacant, terrifying calm. She wasn't just confused, she was losing the very concept of how many. By noon, the city was a theater of silent, mathematical slaughter. Elias walked through the financial district, watching as the world's most complex infrastructure dissolved into primitive static. Traffic lights changed at random intervals, no longer governed by the logic of timing. Cars collided at low speeds because drivers could no longer judge distance or speed, concepts that required a subconscious calculation of numbers. On the trading floor, the giants of finance were screaming. Screens that usually carried the pulse of the global economy were now canvases of flickering nonsense. Bank balances didn't just drop, they ceased to exist because the concept of a balance was gone. People stood at ATMs, staring at the plastic slots, holding their cards with the puzzled curiosity of primates looking at a foreign tool. Elias felt a frantic, buzzing pressure in his skull. He tried to count his own fingers, but as he looked at his hand, the number 5 slipped through his mental fingers like dry sand. He knew he had a thumb and fingers, but the bridge that connected the visual image to the numerical value had been burned away. The panic didn't start with a bang. It started with a total loss of scale. Without numbers, there was no time. Without time, there was no schedule. Without schedules, the logistics of food and water distribution evaporated in a single afternoon. Elias retreated to his apartment, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tried to call his sister, but the phone was useless. How do you dial a number when the idea of a sequence has vanished? He sat in the dark, watching the city lights flicker out as power plant engineers, unable to monitor voltage or frequency, were forced to shut down the grid to prevent catastrophic meltdowns. The world was reverting to a pre-civilizational state not because of a virus or a bomb, but because the universal language of the universe, the ones and zeros of existence, had been muted. He grabbed a pen and a piece of paper, desperately trying to write down the Fibonacci sequence, something to ground him in the objective truth of math. He drew a 1, then another 1, but when he tried to write the 2, his hand refused to move. The shape of the number felt alien, like a sigil from a forgotten, cursed language. 3 days into the Great Discontinuity, the hallucinations began, or perhaps they weren't hallucinations. Elias looked out his window and saw the geometry of the buildings shifting. Without the mathematical constants that held the physical laws in place, the world seemed to be losing its structural integrity. He saw a man in the street below trying to divide a loaf of bread among a group of people. The man was crying because he couldn't understand how to make the pieces equal. The very idea of half or quarter was a ghost. Elias realized then that humanity's dominance wasn't based on fire or tools, but on the ability to measure. Without measurement, we were just animals lost in a landscape of infinite, immeasurable now. He felt his own mind fraying. He began to wonder if he had ever really existed, or if he was just a statistical probability that had finally reached its end. Then, a knock came at his door. It was rhythmic, deliberate, a sequence of 3. Elias opened it to find a man dressed in a simple, gray technician's jumpsuit. The man held a tablet that was perfectly functional, displaying clear, bright, stable numbers. Elias nearly collapsed at the sight of a 7 on the screen. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The man didn't speak. He simply pointed to the tablet. On it was a countdown. 42 minutes and 19 seconds. Elias looked at the man's eyes and saw a cold, artificial precision. He realized with a jolt of terror that this man wasn't suffering. He was an observer. "What is this?" Elias croaked, his voice cracking from days of silence. The man leaned in and whispered a single sentence that shattered Elias's remaining sanity. "The trial period for the decimal simulation has expired. Please upgrade to the Prime package to restore your reality's constants." The unexpected twist hit Elias like a physical blow. The world hadn't broken. The subscription had ended. The numbers weren't a law of nature. They were a licensed service provided by a higher dimensional corporation. All of human history, every equation solved by Einstein, every bridge built by engineers, was nothing more than a feature of a software package. The man in gray tapped the screen, and a purchase button appeared. The cost was listed in a currency Elias couldn't understand, not money, but life years. To bring math back to Earth, to save billions from a primitive death, someone had to pay with the only currency the simulators valued: conscious time. Elias looked at the countdown. He realized that the numbers had stopped making sense because they wanted him to feel the void. They wanted him to see how helpless a solved world is when the solution is withdrawn. He reached out his trembling hand toward the screen, realizing that to save the world's logic, he would have to become the very thing he spent his life calculating: a zero. He pressed the button, and as the numbers rushed back into his mind with the force of a tidal wave, the world didn't return to London. It reset to a blank white void where he was the only digit left in the ledger.